Welcome to this December webinar, Mapping America's Healthy Democracy Ecosystem. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I direct the National Civic League's All-America City Award, as well as our DC office. For those of you less familiar with the League, we are a 130-year-old nonprofit, and we aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. The All-America City Award is our flagship program. It began in 1949 to really recognize exceptional civic engagement happening in communities to solve local challenges. We use the All-America City Award to celebrate local civic engagement accomplishments in specific communities. And then we use this monthly webinar series to share examples of projects and tools that could be helpful in a community's civic engagement efforts. The creators of the map that we're here to talk about today are going to talk to you, and they're very hopeful and confident that it will be a great resource for those of you working to strengthen and defend America's democracy. But before we dive into that map and the process of creating it, I just can't help myself when I have a captive audience to plug the All-America City Award. So the 2024 theme for the All-America City Award is Strengthening Democracy Through Local Action and Innovation. You will submit 3 project ideas if you choose to apply. On your screen, you will see some examples of work that you might apply under. So we're talking about anything that removes barriers to participating in civic life, anything that encourages voter education or engagement, or participation, dialogue and deliberation, and bridging work. You have some important dates here on your screen. We are currently in the process of receiving applications. If you think this year's theme makes sense for your community or a community you know of that's doing great work in this area, feel free to email me, or we can even set up a one-on-one call to discuss if this is a good year for you all to participate. Enough of my plug, though. Here today, we're going to talk about mapping America's healthy ecosystem. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that you are all muted upon entry. I'm going to ask you to remain so, just to break down background noise, with the exception of a few Q&A and interactive portions, which you will be prompted for. So you can unmute yourself during those and or put your chats in the questions. We are recording today's webinar. The webinar, as well as the slides and some additional resources, will be emailed to you at the address that you registered under at the conclusion of today's call. And with that, I am happy to hand it off to our first speaker of the day, Carolyn Lukensmeyer. Carolyn?
Rebecca, thank you very much. And welcome to all of you who are joining us so close to the winter holidays. Just a minute to tell you the agenda for our hour together. First, in a moment, I will introduce the project team that is leading this work. And then we will go to covering the overview, the background project and how we've defined the ecosystem, of which there'll be a Q&A after that segment. Then we will shift to actually looking at the data visualizations that we are ready to share, including the database content. There are 3 geography networks and a dashboard sample. And again, we'll pause for Q&A. And our last segment will be moving forward next steps. Very important to us because lots of you on this webinar can actually engage and help with this work going forward. So let me just take a moment to the 5 of us who are leading this effort: myself, Matt Leiniger at the National Civic League, Rachel Fursch, a strategic consultant that's worked in the democracy field for years, Hala Harik Hayes, who comes out of deep community engagement in the city of Washington and America Speaks and citizen public engagement folks, and Nick Vallejos, who is our primary desk researcher and a fabulous writer if you don't know his work. So again, let me move on to the project overview. Fundamentally, this has been a collective effort of a lot of people besides the 5 of us. In addition to us, the core project team, I'm waiting. We've had tech specialists who are essential from the National Council on Citizenship, from, Conference on Citizenship, from the Bridge Alliance, and from a really fine private sector organization called Decision Path Consulting. Our next layer are collaborators. And there are four who we've spent significant time with are the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the National Civic League, the Democracy Funders Network, and Johns Hopkins New Agora Institute. Lots and lots of organizations have shared data and expertise. The next time you see a presentation from us, it'll take a full slide to put all the organizations that are responding to our request to sharing data. In terms of the project's background, I first want to just give you a brief overview of our mission. Our goal is to identify, categorize, and quantify existing organizations, networks, and funders who are doing excellent work to protect healthy democracy in our country. We want this to be a compelling interactive resource that educates and empowers users of all types. We actually have had in mind four audiences: practitioners who are actually doing this work on the ground, both in national organizations and equally, maybe even eventually more important, in local communities. Then we want to make transparent who the funders are supporting all of this work. We know that in some communities, community leaders are beginning to look for resources to engage the public in more meaningful ways. And we hope these interactive visualizations will be a huge support to them. Some of you have heard me say this before. The audience actually closest to my own heart is the American people. What I've been able to see in my 30 years of work here is people are hungry, but they don't know what to do to help the country right its ship. So that is a huge audience, and we're going to ask you for help about how we reach them. And last, I want to spend just a moment on the process we've been through since we started in February of this year. Initially, we held a strategy session with 25 leaders of organizations and funders. We wanted to increase the number of leaders that influence the framework we're working from. So we did interviews with an additional 50 very diverse experts across the various kinds of democracy reform. Then, as you saw, we've put a lot of effort into developing collaborations with organizations, coalitions, campus centers, practitioners, and frankly, some elected officials. A big portion of the work that has happened all along the way is data collection, creating the lists, the databases, public records, and scraping, which you'll hear more about later. One of the first challenges we faced was, what's the criteria for inclusion in this ecosystem map? Who are the groups that engage in, support, and advocate for work that strengthens our democracy? So I'm not going to give you all the detail, but I'm going to give you highlights of four critical roles that we felt had to be represented. First is those who are directly engaging citizens, those who are helping citizens and elected officials really make better public decisions. All of the Americans who are involved in national service or local community service and volunteering in the hundreds of ways you can do that. Any group that is voicing their concerns to power. And we also understand that economic collaboration is fundamental to our democracy. The next big category is all those organizations that are promoting the bridging field, relationships across differences, civic technology, really experimenting with how we can take this work to scale. And then critical is informing and engaging youth as a specific demographic that hasn't had a life experience to feel that democracy is that important. Obviously, we're looking at any organization that is facilitating interactions between citizens and journalists, citizens and media writ large, and among the members of a community to accomplish any problem they'd like to solve together. Also, at this moment in time, given the threats both to our democratic institutions and our democratic culture, We're looking for all those organizations that are protecting the core elements of what it means to be a thriving democracy: human rights, free and fair elections, and of course, the rule of law. Equally important, we had to make some decisions about who will be excluded. Any organizations that has any evidence of violence or hate speech. And we made a critical decision that we're doing no political partisan inclusion. And although robust work is happening around the world, and maybe there'll be a later chapter of this, but currently we're not including any international organizations. I now want to turn it over to Nick Vallejos, who will talk with you about how we've classified all these organizations. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks. So from a research perspective, we use two approaches to help us categorize the types of democracy work that make up a healthy ecosystem in America. Both methods are informed by qualitative research and interpretation. So the top-down first approach that we have, I've been referring this as an abductive approach, primarily because it involves meaning making and iteration concerning various types of strands of democracy work in collaboration with experts in the field. And so, as Carolyn mentioned, we had an initial strategy with 25 representatives. We came up together with a list of categories that were then fielded. One of the questions fielded in with our 50 interviewees was their thoughts on these categories and the category work. And so over the course of several months, we have scoped and reworded various categories to come up with a current list that you'll see later on of 12 expert-driven categories. The second approach and the second method is what we've been referring to as an inductive approach. And by this, we mean we started without assumptions and just visited websites of organizations provided by our collaborators. We manually tagged over 500 organizations based on their self-identified goals. We found these on About Us pages, mission pages, or scanning programmatic goals. So the bottom-up approach adds a significant degree of nuance to our database and how we capture sort of the different spaces of the democracy landscape. So whereas our top-down categories stem from trusted sources of leadership across many different types of organizations, our bottom-up approach goes straight to the sources themselves, seeking out how different organizations prefer to categorize their own work. So on the next slide, we provide the two category lists, and just a reminder that you can access these on our website, I believe in the chat, and there's going to be a follow-up email with these. And you'll notice that there are significant overlaps between the lists, but we hope and feel that the two approaches can be used for distinct visualizations and purposes in relation to interrelated applications. So just a couple thoughts on these. One benefit of an expert set of categories is that you can have a fairly broad and yet scope 10,000-foot view of the different types of democracy work. Another benefit, because our ambition is to make this resource nonpartisan, is that we can make these categories broadly encompassing, utilizing a lexicon that sort of covers across the political spectrum. A benefit from the bottom-up approach is that we allowed more leeway to delve more into the particular aspects of democracy work, which reflects a lexicon more closely aligned to the type of democracy work other organizations are claiming to pursue. It should be noted here that at least the bottom-up list is not exhaustive. It's living and breathing, and as we constantly come across new organizations, that list will evolve. Nonetheless, in combination, we showcase that there's room for plural methods. So hopefully what you gather from this is that both inductive and abductive can help us more comprehensively define the democracy work in America, and allows us to sort of refine and create different understandings of the various types of organizations and projects that are being pursued across the country. So at this point, I think we'd like to invite a Q&A with the audience to ask questions. I'm sure there's some that have been in the chat box, but you're more than welcome to ask these with your mic off, and anything that about that Carolyn mentioned or what I just discussed.
Guys, a couple of people have brought up the question, which is a really good question. How are we actually defining a hate speech in terms of our excluding organizations that engage in hate speech?
That's an excellent question. I think we have tried to match the kind of definitions of hate speech that are currently prominently used by the organizations that track that, the Southern Poverty Law Center, ACLU. So we are aligning our decisions with what are generally accepted standards about hate speech.
And by the way, in addition to using the chat, if you want to unmute yourself during the Q&A section, please, people are welcome to unmute yourself. Just ask your questions verbally. John Stevens asked about economic. Noticed that kind of the line about economic collaboration in that slide a couple slides ago, and wondered how we were kind of going at that. I did put a couple of the different goals we're using that are related to economics. I kind of pasted them into the chat. You can see them a little bit more easy to read form in the PDFs that we sent. But we're certainly open to thoughts about that, because how do you kind of include the various kind of democracy supporting economic efforts in the map has been a question for us throughout. So open to other ideas about that.
Rebecca, it occurs to me it might be nice at this point to take the word questions off the screen and actually show the folks who are joining here with us while we're responding to questions.
It looks like Walter Roberts has signed up if you want to jump in here.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm very excited about what I've seen so far. And I guess, let's see, my question or point has to do with leaving out anything that has to do with political parties. So there's things like the Forward Party and groups that are working on getting independents elected. So that's not exactly a party, but that's electoral. And I guess my question or point would be, even if you aren't scraping and including that category, it's a huge category in terms of the health of our democracy, is how we turn to a principled politics and the parties and the efforts that are trying to do that. And maybe there's a way to just have a placeholder, and however your website and other places in the future would represent that there is activity going on there and we just don't track it, but to acknowledge it and appreciate it just by giving it a category called it's there, but we don't track it, or something like that. So if that deserves a comment, go ahead.
Well,
I think that's a great point. Go ahead, Carolyn.
I was just going to say it's a point well taken, and we made a determination that in our current environment, including any of those kinds of organizations, even Forward is the one that you happen to give an example of, risks losing some of the range of 501c3, 501c4 work that we really want to use this resource. And your point's well taken, whether it's with our map or someone else's, that is probably a set of work that should also be acknowledged. You might have wanted to add something to that, Nick. Feel free.
I just think that we are aware of and potentially even capturing some of these in the way that you had mentioned. Whether or not we use this sort of data and information, I don't know that we're at that point, but there is definitely a possibility. We have come across networks of political parties and the types of democracy work and political reforms that they're pursuing, but that's not the primary, categorization, or they're not necessarily being part of it. But there is room, like you said, to have these buckets there, because we are capturing at least some of this information in our database.
And a quick follow-up, the National Governors Association, for example, and those are all elected officials, would they be included in your database or listing somewhere?
We haven't addressed that question. That would be equally true for secretaries of state. It would be equally true for any of those categories of elected officials.
Yeah, I think we already have at least some of them, NLC, ICMA. There's a whole set of them that have, many of which have specific democracy supporting role. I mean, not only the big picture, but in the kind of much more fine-grained ways. So yeah.
And the disagreeing better campaign and the whole alliance with the bridging field. So NGA, for example, is hugely important and very embedded in the work that's happening anyway, my point, thank you for taking my questions.
What I think is interesting about that, Walt, in terms of how NGA operates, that campaign will last for as long as the Utah governor is, Spencer Cox is the governor. The next governor will choose another choice. And then I do believe that Governor Cox intends to continue that campaign when he's no longer the chair. And then it would be easy for us to continue following that campaign in however he sets it up when he's no longer the chair. It's very complicated with NGA because the agenda literally changes every year.
Nick, Rebecca Townsend asked, pointed out that kind of some categories or some terms are showing up in both the bottom-up goals and the top-down categorizations, and kind of wonders about that and how we envision these working as both top-down and bottom-up. So you might want to explain a bit more about kind of where we got to those two sets of terms.
You mean how we have how there's some significant overlap in the terminology?
Right. So for example, she points out direct democracies in both lists as one example.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, some of this is that initially we had, strategic sessions with interviewees and with a select group of 25 from across the country. And so these are categories that, experts in the field and from these organizations have pointed out, which also overlaps with organizations that we've come across. And so this is, in terms of, designing this from a top-down perspective and a bottom-up, we found these terms being utilized. And so there is going to be overlap. Where you start to see different overlap is in, different types of partisan language for organizations, which we leave space open for various organizations from the right and the left, and then other ways that it's defined. So that's where you'll start to see significant differences in the types of organizations. So long as they meet our criteria of inclusion, that's where you'll start to find, a variety of democracy organizations that don't overlap as much in their terms.
These are some excellent suggestions in terms of things that we are already thinking about and have not thought of. That's exactly why we were interested in doing this kind of webinar today, and we'll continue to do updates as we move forward. I think we now need to move on to the next section of our presentation. So let me turn it over to Hala Harik Hayes about data visualizations. Thanks very much for excellent questions and comments in the chat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hala Harik Hayes. We're now going to turn to sharing with you a little bit of information about what is in our database, and then going to give you a first look at data visualizations. So let's talk a little bit about the database content, and then immediately following this, there will be another Q&A session. So you'll have a chance to ask us questions. So to date, we have records on over 10,500 different organizations all around the country. And go ahead with the next one. Thank you. So we, Carolyn and Nick mentioned early on in the process, we held a strategy session back in April 2023 with 25 experts in the field. And then we followed up with 50 interviews with additional sets of experts from all around the country. And we asked them, one of the questions that we asked folks during those two processes was, what is it that should be included? What would be most useful for you to have as part of this database and as part of this visualization? And so the data that we've collected here comes directly from folks that we've spoken to. We heard firsthand that it would be really helpful to have descriptive information about organizations, those over 10,000 organizations that we have currently, things like the name, the website, the mission statement, contact information. We also heard that people are looking for financial data. So they want to know about tax status. Is this a 501c3 or is it a C4? Is it a different kind of entity? What about their revenue? What about expenses, assets, grant dollar amounts? So financial data is a part of this as well. We also talked about what Nick really focused on in the last section about the different categories of work. So people want to be able to see who are these organizations and what categories do they fall into. So we're hoping to be able to provide and show visualizations about which categories the different organizations fall into. And then finally, networks and coalitions. So we talked early on about the fact that there is a lot of collaboration happening among organizations in the ecosystem, but there's opportunity for so much more networking and so much more collaboration. And so we wanted to actually look at the networks and coalitions that we're currently familiar with and map them out a little bit and figure out who are the organizations that are members of these different networks and coalitions, and how are they connected with other organizations and other networks and coalitions in the field. So one of the maps that we're going to show you in a minute will illustrate that. I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Rachel Firsch, who's going to, again, give you a sort of first look at the data visualizations that we're working on. Rachel.
Thank you, Hala. Thanks to so many of you for joining us today. So we have prepared 3 different data visualizations to give you a sort of sneak peek into the data that we've collected so far. Down the road, we envision that we'll bring this much up to a higher scale. You'll be able to dive in from multiple different vantage points, but these are the 3 that we're sharing today. So the first, I have to switch screens here, is a visualization about the geography of the healthy democracy ecosystem. So Hala mentioned we have 10,500 organizations in our database. At least 9,172 of them are nonprofit organizations. And those are what you can see mapped out here. So at the top, you'll see by state, California having the highest concentration of nonprofit healthy democracy organizations compared to the rest. Down a little bit lower, you see the geographic density, and then to the right of that, it's by filing status. You'll see a concentration on the coasts, which should not surprise too many people. However, we do hope to do a little bit more in-depth research to try to identify the local and community organizations that might not be so easy to find just by talking to experts in the field. So we can uncover all different avenues for people to get engaged with healthy democracy work. All of our visualizations will be interactive. So for example, you could click on a state. Here you got Minnesota. These 2 filter in, and it gives you an idea of how things lay in that state. There's no surprise here that Minneapolis is the highest concentration of groups. So our next visualization is talking about the networks that Hala just mentioned. So we have in our database over 70 healthy democracy networks and coalitions. About 50 of them are national, all on different topics related to healthy democracy. Some people call them subfields. In this visualization, we have all of the networks that we have 10 members tagged for, 10 or more members. So all 70 are not represented here. We hope to get the membership lists for all 70 of those, but obviously this is a smaller number. I think it's 15 to 17. So the interactive portion of this right now is that if you hover over a network, for example, the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, you get your little blurb about what it's all about. And we have in our database 234 members of SLSV Coalition mapped out. So interesting things you can take from this, all of these blue members have number 1. So it means according to our records of all of these 17 organizations, they are only a member, or sorry, 17 networks. They're only a member of Students Learn, Students Vote, all the blue dots. However, if you look, so you can see that there's higher concentrations. These purple groups are connected to 4 plus different networks. So for example, if we click on Unify America, you can see that not only are they a member of SLSV, but of all of these other networks as well. Gives you a sense of the interconnectedness of the fields. Some groups who are really plugged in and others who are just on the fringes. And we'll also identify those groups that aren't a member of any of these networks and coalitions and should provide opportunity for recruitment and expansion. Okay, and then our last visualization, go back here. Oh, I have to go all the way around. Here we go. So we put together a data dashboard for you. This is great for people who are data nerds, which I lovingly call myself. So this would be an example of, it's filtered, but I'll unfilter it. This is a sample. We've got 16 groups here. We picked them because they're sort of geographically representative. Wouldn't read into the ones that we picked, but this is how we can show you how some of the data interacts. So if you look at the map over here, let's say we pick an organization, we want to narrow down or zoom in on it. So here's issue 1. Here's a lot of the data Hala mentioned that we've collected about issue 1. Whoop. So they're based in DC. You can see their revenue over the years, how it's changed, what their mission is, and all of the networks that they're a member of. Right now, we only have them listed under Fix Us among those 16 that we showed before. If you're curious, you could say, I wonder what other groups are members of Fix Us. Oh, and this shows that their main tag is electoral reform. So let's say we want to figure out who else is in Fix Us. Click on that, and it highlights it for you. You can see their revenue over the years, how it compares to the average revenue per group, and what all the different goals are that those various organizations work on. Again, further, there's also a few other insights you can tell from this kind of data. So a piece of my mind is an interesting one. You can see they're only founded in 2021. However, despite being pretty new to the scene, they're already a member of 3 different national networks, coalitions. Yikes. I'm the most practiced at doing this. So, you know, of course, the moment I'm showing it to hundreds of people is when I start clicking around. But here you can see that just despite only being founded, they've already doubled their revenue. They're members of 3 different coalitions. And in theory, if they use some of our network visualizations, maybe they'll be able to be connected to more. So that is our preview. I'll go back to the slide though. As we determined before, it's really not that helpful to have this slide up. So we would welcome any questions you all have about the database or visualizations, and I will take down this slide so we can see faces again.
So from the chat, we have questions about whether or not we've connected to AmeriCorps around national service host sites.
Yeah, so yes is the short answer. At the recent NCOC gathering where we presented the National Conference on Citizenship, there was a representative of AmeriCorps there. We have hopefully a call coming up on the calendar. We initially scanned their website to collect a lot of their organizations, to put like a lot of their membership organizations or their affiliated organizations to include in the database. I think we haven't formalized the data enough yet that it was shown in that visualization, but yes, we absolutely will be talking to AmeriCorps. So I see Walt again.
How about John? John's got his hand up too.
Go to John
Oh,
first.
John, great.
Thanks, Walt. Say again how you determine whether organizations are connected and how you built those networks. And again, my guess is that's a really challenging and can be a slippery slope of where you draw the line.
Yeah, so there's really 2 primary ways we collected this data, actually even 3. One is a lot of these networks and coalitions have membership lists up on their website. Some of them, the ones that I have become very fond of, have like CSV files that you can download, and it's very easy to incorporate them into a database. But others, we went through one at a time and tagged them. The even easier way that we came up with these lists is some coalitions sent us their membership lists. They knew that we were doing this data collection. They wanted to be represented. And so they sent us the data for the people who are considered members. And then the third way is that throughout the course of our interviews and our conversations with various people in the fields, people have self-reported if they're a member of a network or coalition. And so we added that into our data. Obviously, Matt will get into this, but one of the next steps will be data verification and completion. So right now, we don't have the full network lists of all these organizations. We're not claiming we do. But as we go forward, we'll try to complete them as much as possible. And we hope to have a function or plan to have a function where groups can write in and edit their own data. So if they look at their sort of profile on the site and think that the network representation is incorrect or any of the other data, they can submit changes and we will reflect what they submit after a verification process.
Walt, if it's okay, I'd love to interject a question from the chat for Hala and Rachel to talk about, which is a teeny tiny question from Wendy Feliz, which says, is it your sense that each state needs to have a minimum of these components to have a functioning state democracy? is there value doing this work on a state-by-state basis, which I think is a very large question, but very interesting. Again, I think that this is something that we can, in fact, really delve into using this data. But thoughts from you guys?
I actually think Carolyn might be best suited to answer
Carolyn.
that question, if you're up for it, Carolyn.
I'd be happy to. And actually, Wendy, I actually responded to you in chat. we do think that making these connections state by state is very significant. And we are, in some states, what we're discovering is there is a lot of knowledge within the state of work being done by other categories of democracy work in the way we've defined them. In other states, it just doesn't exist. So we're hoping that one of the first functions the map will provide is making it completely visible inside the state as to who's doing what. And sometime in the near future, we'll probably be putting out a paper about civic infrastructure, following papers that have been put out in the past, in which we do believe both at a community level and at a state level, it is transparent what kinds of infrastructure have to exist for people to live and work together and behave democratically in a sustained way over time. So I would say it's a resounding yes to your question. And we want to be as much of a resource to helping both communities and states be able to do that work as possible. Hope that's helpful.
We still have a few minutes in this section. Walt, if you had another question to add, I think we can go ahead.
I think I would yield, if there's anything else from the chat that wants to get addressed, I'd yield to that first.
I haven't seen anything. If someone wants to
Just a quick,
yeah, good. Go ahead, Debbie.
No, the question that I have is, do you have a timeline for when those of us who like to dig into the data are going to have a chance to do that? Like, what's your deadline or timeline?
Sure.
You notice Rachel's sudden nervous intake of breath when you asked her.
Can I take a stab at this, or would someone else like to go for it?
No, I think we're trying to get this where people can actually play with it in the next quarter of the year. And then there's a lot of, we're doing our best. There's a lot of hoops to go through, and I'll describe some of those in a minute. But that is our aim, and we are trying to make that as a deadline.
And I don't think it's out of place to say, as with a lot of the work in this field, if there are resources who would like to contribute to the project, I think that would speed up the timeline. The more we have to work with, the faster we can work. So shameless plug right there.
Maybe I'll go ahead and jump in. So I'll just admit or acknowledge that the perspective that I come from is that there's a pro-democracy movement of many movements, and it's relatively not known by the public at large. And the access for people coming in to this movement of many movements could be through Citizen Connect a lot. It's really designed for that. It's heavily into the bridging field. That was its inception. But as Christina and others at Bridge Alliance are working on having other sort of portals, sort of, the structural reform, the social cohesion, social justice, whatever those things are. So I guess I'm saying what my bias is when it comes time for this data and all this information to go onto a website that you are going to continue to build, and who the audience is and what the categories are, so that so I guess my question is, well, we're going to be talking about this as time goes along. So Carolyn and Rachel and people from my group will be talking about this. But if there's anything to be said about how these categorizations can be applied to your website, where they're applicable to another website like Citizen Connect, and then there's the funders sort of look into it, the local look into it, how many different looks and how many different sort of ways to get in and find yourself getting to the right place. It's almost like curation through, categorization. Any comments about that? That's what I find myself thinking about.
Well, for
Yeah,
me,
no,
Walt, oh, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
no, well, I think one thing is we've been trying to work this out with all of the people you named, because we're all trying to make sure that we all kind of don't reinvent the wheel. We support each other's efforts. A bunch of different mapping efforts have different audiences. So somebody in the chat mentioned Ari Hahn and Milan DeVries, who are mapping the modern Agora at Johns Hopkins, and their focus is research. They have a fantastic article that came out a couple of weeks ago called "The Unequal Landscape of Civic Opportunity." So they have they have an audience, a set of data, a set of methodological tools, and we're learning from them, and they're learning from us. Same thing with Democracy Funders Network. They're focused more on grant seekers and grant makers, and we've been partnering with them. Certainly, Citizens Connect and Bridge Alliance, and all of us are kind of trying to make sure that we collectively serve all of the needs. Where exactly we divide the lines, or how we exactly collaborate in one setting to another, that all is still being worked out. But I think we do want to have something that is helpful to the individual citizen in their community, helpful to people who are thinking about their community from a kind of civic infrastructure perspective. What elements of democracy do I not have in my community or in my state? Certainly national pictures of that, certainly researchers, grant makers. So we have a lot of kind of people to serve here, but I think that so far what's been great is just the kind of the enthusiasm among the people trying to do this, and our willingness to work together.
Somebody just asked in the chat, and I know, Matt, you were going to say this, but how can people who know organizations who are on this webinar get those organizations onto the map? So I'm just going to answer the question. You can say more about it. We will be sending out a form which allows you to actually put the organization's data. You'll be entering the data yourself, sending to us, and it will get added to the database. Didn't want to leave that question hanging.
Oh, yeah. So in fact, that's maybe a good segue, because I think we're about time for going to the next part anyway, which includes that. And so we can go back to slides and start talking about the next steps, parts of this. And part of what we have to do is to figure out, and what a number of you have asked more about, which is, you can go to the next one, Rachel, the question of the portal itself. How do we give people a chance to kind of log into this, understand, and start kind of messing around, looking more closely at different sorts of dots on these maps, and using the dashboards, all that kind of stuff. That's what we hope to have ready for you to be able to analyze the data we have, or work with the data we have sometime in the next 3 months or so. So that's one category of work. Oh, okay. I was supposed to talk first about data collection, which is an ongoing thing. We have, as you heard, we have 10,600 records. We have about 70 plus fields for record. We don't have complete records for well, we do for a few, but for the vast majority of the 10,000, we don't have completely filled out all of the 70 fields. So that's part of what we're going to need to be doing, is kind of filling out more of the information about the organizations we have listed, in addition to finding other lists, other organizations. We continue to welcome submissions from you all, lists in particular, maps, in the state of Kansas, or within the field of participatory budgeting, or whatever you want to give us. We've been collecting those all along, and that's been powering a lot of data collection so far. We will also be working with some of our other mapping partners to help use some of their own tools for finding other organizations and other sets of groups. So that's data collection, that's web development, which I talked about first. And then the third piece is testing and feedback. And we would love to have your kind of feedback when we have a portal that can be tested. We would like to have some of you to be testing that out with us and giving us some constructive criticism about how it works. We'll be doing various other ways to kind of make sure that this is something that is useful for people. As Carolyn said, we have a form, and in fact, the link may already be in the chat, but we have an Airtable data submission form. So basically, if you have data you want to give us about an organization or about your organization, all you need to do right now is click on that and it will open it up for you, and you can kind of pick among all of our fields and kind of fill in data and so on. And then the last part in our is to kind of help us, we all want to kind of work together, I think, to help figure out how people can use this in all the different ways that I mentioned a minute ago. And particularly at the community level, because we think that is where, that's the ground floor of democracy is where we live, in our towns and cities and our neighborhoods. And the question of whether we have the civic infrastructure we need is, I think, the question of the day. And this map could be helpful to people to figure out, to understand what actually they already have, in addition to the things that they might need or the things they might borrow or copy from another community or other sector. So we think that this will be particularly helpful to people at the community level. One of the things we'll be trying to offer are trainings of various kinds for people who want to kind of use this map to help think about their community or their state. So let me then ask you all to chime in again. Again, you can put these things in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself. But we're interested in the questions you have, and also we're interested in your answers to this question of what would make this resource the most valuable for you, either your organization, you personally, or the field or the part of the healthy democracy ecosystem that you inhabit. And anybody want to give me from the chat anything?
Matt, there's a question about asking us to say more about how communities could use this as a resource, where it doesn't start either with a funder or with a practitioner, sure, but the community itself.
Well, as Walter, somebody else said earlier, I think our field is not a field, it's a whole set of fields. And part of the thing we have to overcome, I think, is the fact that people don't recognize that service, civic ed, participation, bridge building, civic media, name another 12 things, they rely on each other. They, for the most part, in my experience, don't interact that well. They don't recognize each other in most cases. And what we really need to be thinking about is this kind of larger kind of ecosystem view for our communities. And I think Wendy's question was also going in this direction of like, well, what combination of things do you need? And that's an open question. And each community, each state might have its own answer. But I think that kind of looking at the map geographically and network-wise and in other ways can help people figure out, well, what do we already have here, including the things I might know about, the things that I don't. And if I look at another community of a similar size, in some other part of the country, what do they got that I might want to be thinking about in terms of the gaps or weaknesses that we have in our own local scene. But
Debbie Lynn has her hand raised.
Debbie Lynn.
Hi, everyone. Good to be in community with y'all again. So just to for a use case, if you will, too, one of the reasons I'm really interested and want to dive into this database is so that the new project I'm working on with American Future is about helping people do individual life goals, but then helping communities be informed by the individual life goals. And so this, the use case that I'm thinking of is how can I go into a community that has some resources, but maybe not all of them, and help do that weaving that you were just talking about for the betterment of that community, even if I don't live there.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I just wanted to say that, is that a use case that this will be helpful with?
Sure, I hope so. Any of my colleagues want to weigh in on that? My answer is yes.
Well, Debbie Lynn, what comes to my mind is you might want to spend a little time with Michael Skolar at Aspen, who's running the Weave project, because they're starting from the same place that you're starting at one of your starting points, which is that there are a lot of individuals in communities who are already doing amazing weaving work. You're focusing on their view of the future, but part of the goal is to get those individuals connected in the communities so that it could become some collective individual voices to have a different level of quality of engagement in that community. But I would think, given how long they've been at that, there might be some really interesting use cases that Michael would share with you.
Oh,
Gotcha.
I owe him a call already.
Danny, go ahead.
Thank you. So I come at this from a pretty selfish standpoint. I'm with the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, which, as Rachel mentioned earlier, is a network of actually north of 300 organizations, though there's only about 200 some that are fully listed on our website. So you can be forgiven for the discrepancy there. But we have already on our website sort of a low-res version of what you all put together of just our network. You know, it's essentially a search bar where you can search by state and region and different types. And I look at this tool and I think, wouldn't it be great if we could put this tool or a version, you know, a closer version of it on our website for our partners specifically to, you know, use. And I'm wondering if you envision this tool as being something that can be integrated later on onto other websites, if it's something that, you know, and I would totally respect this, you envision as being fully proprietary and staying, you know, on your properties, and or just how we might work together to make that use case as broad as possible for all the different audiences that you're looking to reach.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so part of what you're saying is, could one use some of the same data tools, methodology, and so on to do a network specific version? So just SLSV members on your website, but using some of the same machinery that we've developed. That's part of the way. And then there's another version of that, which might be the whole thing on another portal. You know, and we haven't really grappled with either one of those that much yet. We've been assuming that there'll be one, or maybe, I mean, the second question I think is partly related to our work with these other partners, because they each of them have their own or will have their own portals of one kind or another. We want to make sure that they kind of work together in some way. So that's kind of something we've been grappling with. I don't think we've thought really about kind of whether one could use the same machinery for a single network, or whether that would be possible technologically, or how difficult it would be. I'm sure it's possible, but it may be too hard to make it worth it.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Just one thing I would add to that is that, right, our philosophy thus far has been not to lean into proprietary issue. Like, we've really been sharing data as much as possible. I think obviously we want the people who help fund us and sponsor us to get the recognition they deserve, but I think if we can find a way to make it accessible, we will, and we'd love to be able to share data. And just on a related note, I just wanted to say, Danny, your background photo, that looks like a really loving older sister holding that baby, and I just thought that was worth noting.
I was just going to say, if you all ever need any updated staff pictures, this one in my background is a great one of Rachel. She's the one holding the baby. She's not the Ninja Turtle, just so everybody's aware.
So Danny, I want to add, given what you said about what we have on our database from SLSV, it's very important that you connect with us as quickly as possible to get the rest of your partner organizations into the database. That's part of what will make this sing.
Well, believe me when I say we're working with those partner organizations to get them into our database as well. So as soon as we have them, we haven't passed them over.
Believe me, we understand.
Nick, Hala, who else looking at the chat? Any other things we haven't answered in the chat? Sorry, I'm sorry. While I see your hand out, just want to make sure we got everybody a chance to speak. Go ahead, Nick.
There is an interesting question here, is about potentially how to get included in beta testing and maybe use user research for the map. Are there any opportunities there?
Great question.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, one, we're going to save this chat, so you've now just enrolled yourself in beta testing. So thank you so much. And
tell us if you do not want to receive emails from us.
You now are required to opt out. But two, we'll be following up with emails, and we have a distribution list right now that's for updates. We haven't started collecting names specifically for beta testing, but I imagine the best way to get that information will be to submit your name for our distribution list, and we'll send out any opportunities that are going to arise via that list and whatever channels we can. So the more connected you are with our group, the more likely you'll be to hear of multiple opportunities to get involved.
I'm going to jump in terms of some of the comments in chat, and I'm not going to remember who this was, but somebody mentioned North Carolina. If you're sitting in North Carolina and know a tremendous number of local organizations in North Carolina that should be on this map, we would love for you to just send us a link to whatever way you have those organizations, whether they're in a database or not. That's how we have been getting a deeper dive into several states, because as you well understand, at a national level, much of this work is just not visible to national organizations. So part of our commitment has been to be as fully inclusive of excellent work done by local, non-affiliated to national organizations as possible.
Awesome.
Maybe that's a good thing to segue off of. Any other chats before? I'm happy
The
to.
chat's now so voluminous that we will send it all and try to answer questions that we haven't gotten to in the chat, but it's now gotten so big that it's hard to navigate. Go ahead, Walt.
Well, I just, hats off to the local place-based aspect of this. So in our world of the Intermovement Impact Project, we do focus on local intersections and have a whole project based on how do things connect at the locality. And we recognize that there's just a bunch of stuff that just happens organically that we have no idea about. And so that's one point to make. Number two is, as you're making these as you're doing the mapping, turning it into a portal, and then making it useful to some number of audiences. And then there's Horizons Project, and there's, let's say there's another dozen sort of portals that are, really good. And some of them are highly curated. And that is sort of like an important thing. The mass of the data can be a barrier to usefulness. And so some of these portals will be highly curated, and it'll be a very small set of things that are tried and true and trusted or something. But I guess my point is that the local organizers that are reaching to the state and national level to understand more about what else they can pull into their effort, and then how do you be a catalyst to have this meshwork of portals, what you're designing and how others are designing, and how that all holds together with some intentionality, appreciating the highly curated versus the very big database. So I'm just sort of pointing to the interesting challenge that we all have and that you're in the middle of, and just open it up, see if there's any comments about that. But I just want to take that moment to applaud you on the heroic and, Herculean thing that you've done so far, and the value that it will bring.
Thank you, Walt. And that's actually a good kind of point to kind of start our wrap up with, because that is exactly what we're trying to do. And I think that we got into this, the five of us, because we have much more of a field building interest. We think researchers are important, they need to be served, not just them. We think grant makers and grant seekers need to find each other. Those audiences need to be served, not just them. Local community, organizers and connectors need to be served. We're trying to kind of do the best we can to make something that's going to connect with play well with other maps, other portals that as they arise, and that give people what they need. So, and that's the reason why this is possible, even, is simply all of you and others like you who've already been so helpful to us by giving us lists, by telling us about other things, by giving us advice in one way or another. So this has been terrific. It's been a real labor of Hercules and a joy to work on this with many of you. And we have a long way to go, clearly, but the list is alive, and that's thanks in no small part to all of you. And so we want to thank you for your partnership and your advice and your help all along the way. And obviously, as we said, we will be keeping you on our lists. Please feel free to opt out if you don't want to be on them, but we'll try to keep you as updated as we can as we move forward, and to give you opportunities for beta testing and all these other things that might be helpful to you and to us. So thank you all. Great to see you all today, and have a wonderful holiday season.